Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Rick Dacey, Senior Minister, Wesley Congregational Life.
Generosity. Yeah, most people, I think, would agree that generosity is a good thing. At least in principle. You don't hear a lot of people bad-mouthing generosity. And generosity is a vital part of faithful discipleship. It's not an optional extra. You know, there are a lot of optional extras in the Christian life. Like courtesy, for example. Courtesy is a good thing. I like people who are courteous. I like to be courteous. But, you know, we don't pray or sing, "Oh God, you are so courteous." If we do, we should stop singing that. Because God is not a courteous God. Well, look at Jesus and all his human interactions. So many of his human interactions are anything but courteous. But God is always generous. We see that in the parable we heard tonight. Julie read for us. This most famous of parables. We see God's amazingly generous spirit right at the very beginning of the parable. The younger son comes and he asks for his share of the inheritance early. Think about that for a minute. Think about that. He comes to his father and he says, "So, you know, I know that I have an inheritance coming. I don't know how long you're going to go on living, but I say I've got a lot of living to do. So how about we break out the will early, and you just give me what's coming to me?" Can you imagine this conversation with the father going differently than it does in the parable? Can you imagine the father responding differently? "Let me get this straight, boy. You can't stick around long enough to see when I'm going to kick the bucket. So you want your money, my money, now. Is that right? You want what's coming to you? I'll give you what's coming to you." But of course, that's not how the parable goes. That's not the response of the father in Jesus' parable. We can imagine that kind of response because it's a very human response, but this is an insight into the character of God. And the father does not respond that way. The father responds with extraordinary generosity. He gives the son his full inheritance. He gives it to him. There's no guilt trip. There's no, "Oh, how could you do this to your family?" There's no stern lecture about what the father has sacrificed to give this to him. No, he doesn't even give him a logical set of conditions. "Well, all right, you can have it so long as..." No, none of that. He just gives it to him. This is a generous father. And now the father knows his child. He knows this boy. And he knows that he's not likely to be a very good steward of his father's gifts. He knows that he's going to make self-centered, self-serving, short-sighted decisions. He has the wisdom to see all this, and yet he still chooses to give it to him. That's our first glimpse of God's generous spirit. He gives to him generously, extravagantly. He doesn't hold anything back. He simply gives of himself in love. And we see here the character of God. So why do we struggle with generosity? Why do we struggle with sermons about generosity? Why do we struggle with it? If we're honest, I think most of us do struggle in some way, at some level, with generosity. Do you? I mean, you struggle with generosity when you compare yourself to others as if generosity is on some sort of curve or some sort of scale. That scale might make you feel better than some people or might make you feel worse than other people, but somewhere you find yourself on a scale. But either way, real generosity can never be measured on a comparative scale. Real generosity is never about lining ourselves up with other people and seeing how we stack up. You struggle with generosity when you feel some level of resentment when others receive too much generosity, more than their fair share. When they seem to be getting in on easy terms, when they seem like maybe even they're taking advantage. You know that you struggle with generosity when you feel like ministers really shouldn't talk about money in church, even though Jesus talked about money so much and our relationship with it and how we use it in our lives. You struggle with generosity. You struggle with generosity if someone gives you a generous gift and it makes you feel awkward. You're not quite sure what to do with a generous gift or even a generous compliment. You're wondering, how do you reciprocate? How do you earn that? How do you be worthy of that? Generosity can be a very difficult thing. Most of us struggle with generosity at some level, and if you don't, you probably aren't going to get anything out of the rest of this sermon. So you can read your notices and your word and deed. But if you're like me, and most Christians I know, then listen, there is good news for you tonight. Good news in this parable. We've already seen a glimpse of that good news at the beginning of the parable of the prodigal son. When Jesus gets right to the heart of the parable, though, it breaks out into full view. The prodigal son returns. And he has spent all his father's money serving himself. All the money that he spent couldn't buy him love, couldn't buy him respect. In the end, when the money ran out on him, so did all his friends. And here he is, walking back on the road, approaching his father's property. And again, it's not hard to imagine this going differently than it does in the parable. Can you imagine it as he comes over the crest of the hill of the property and his father said, here he comes. And his father might just decide, right, I'll just take a seat here on the veranda and watch him come. Watch him make that slow walk of shame. Wait till he gets to the steps and then let him fall down and grovel. Let him offer whatever apology he might have cooked up on the long journey from that far distant country, and then maybe take him on as a hired hand. Give him a couple of years to work off his debt. Let him learn his lesson. Can you imagine that? But of course, the father doesn't do that. If he had done that, no one would have thought less of him. No one would have thought less after the way that his son had dishonored him and dishonored the family. Even the prodigal son himself figured that would be the best deal he could hope for. But you see, the father isn't interested in offering his son a deal, a quid pro quo. He gives of himself. Again, the Father gives of himself. He doesn't let his son come and grovel. He doesn't wait for his son to come to the veranda. No, while he is still far off, he runs to him and meets him. And that is an arresting image in Jesus' culture, even in our culture, but especially in Jesus' culture. For a father to run for his son like a child, particularly in circumstances like this, it would have been a shocking violation of social decorum. It would have undermined his authority in the house. It would have humiliated him in the community. It would have destroyed his reputation. But here's the thing. The Father doesn't care about any of that. He doesn't care what other people are going to think. He doesn't care about what he might lose. All he cares about is giving of himself in love as he sees his son. He releases his right to wait for his son to come groveling, and he shatters all social expectation by running out to the son, throwing his arms around him and kissing him, all before he even has a chance to offer his canned apology. And this is an act of the most amazing generosity. You see what the Father is doing here, don't you? He overwhelms his son's disgrace with grace. This is the generosity of God. This is the character of God. You know, there is extraordinary material generosity in this parable. The father has already released to the prodigal his share of the inheritance, but he's not done. Even now, even when he's squandered it all in such a disgraceful way, even now, there is more material generosity. And you see here how the material generosity is bound up with a spirit of generosity, a generosity of self. The father gives himself to his child, and the material generosity just flows freely and naturally out of that generous spirit. The father interrupts the son's well-rehearsed, canned apology to give him, now listen, gives him the best robe in the house, the family ring for his finger, sandals for his feet, and then he orders the fatted calf to be killed for a celebration. He ticks off just 4 of the most valuable possessions that the father has. And in a span of just a couple of sentences, he's released them in celebration, in love. It's a remarkable material generosity, but really, the Father's material generosity is just that natural expression of his generous spirit. And that's the way it is with real generosity, isn't it? Not all giving is real generosity. Not all giving is true, generous giving. I mean, people give for a whole range of reasons, all sorts of motivations, and besides generous spirit. Sometimes people give out of a sense of guilt or a begrudging obligation, but no matter how great the amount that they give, there's no generosity in it. The giving isn't flowing from a natural spirit of generosity. And sometimes people give to gain influence or power or a voice or control. You know, one tip-off that a person is not really giving generously is that they still talk about the money as theirs after they give it. You know, a man named Bill came into, true story, a man named Bill came into the minister's office one day and wasn't too pleased with something that was going on in the church, a decision that had been made by the church lay leadership. And he said to the minister, "I don't like what the church is doing with my money." And the minister said, "Well, it sounds to me, Bill, like you haven't given anything at all." And he said, "What do you mean? Do you have any idea how much I give to this church?" And the minister said, "I really don't think you're giving, Bill. Because if you're giving, it's not your money, is it?" Contrast that with the giving of the Father in Jesus' parable. An authentic, generous spirit doesn't give looking for a personal return on investment. It doesn't give with strings attached. It doesn't give continuing to call it my money. A generous spirit simply gives. You know, sometimes people give out of a desire to be recognized for giving. You know, we'd all like to be thanked. We all like to have some acknowledgement, some recognition. But when we give and we don't get thanked, or we don't get that recognition, and it leaves us feeling hollow and empty, it's a pretty good indication that we're not giving out of a generous spirit. We're giving with some other motivation. Now, giving is hard, and generosity is not easy to get our heads and our hearts around. And I think most of us really do struggle with generosity. When we contrast our own giving with the Father in Jesus' parable, you know, he doesn't give out of a desire to be recognized. He gives in a way that is actually calculated to invite ridicule in his culture. He doesn't give to get something in return. His son has squandered so much that he has nothing left to give back. He doesn't give because it's expected, because it's not. Nothing is expected of the Father to give to his Son at this point. There's nothing that he really ought to do for his Son. He isn't saying, well, now you're back. I guess we ought to kill the fatted calf. No. It's not a dreary obligation. It is a joy. A full life, depth of the soul joy. No, he gives freely from this genuine, profound generosity. His giving is uncontainable. He gives out of a pure, unbounded love. It's a stark contrast, but I think if we're honest, if we have an honest self-awareness, most of us would recognize that our giving, whether it's giving of time or talent or treasure, often comes with a complex mix of motivations. Now, if we get stuck there, then we go away with nothing but guilt. If we get stuck where we are, then we get nothing but guilt to either push aside or shove down or push away or ignore. But that's if we get stuck there. God doesn't want us to get stuck there. We struggle. We hear sermons about giving. The Bible says quite clearly in 2 Corinthians 9:7, each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. But you know what? I have never met anybody who has heard a preacher instruct them to be cheerful and has gone away and said, right, I'm cheerful now. It doesn't work that way. Generosity doesn't work that way. We want to give like the Father in Jesus' parable. We want to. We have a longing to do that from the depth of our soul. We want to give joyfully, not bound up with what other people think of us, but flowing from a naturally generous spirit. But how? How do we do that if we're stuck where we are? How do we grow in generosity? How do we nurture that God-given gift of generosity within us? Well, first, we can stop giving to the church. You heard me right. Stop giving to the church. If we're giving to maintain some external institution that exists outside and apart from us, we need to stop giving to the church. We need to stop giving to the church, and we need to start giving as the church, together as community, in celebration, in worship. If we truly want to nurture that God-given gift of generosity within us, if we truly want to experience that sense of joyful celebration that Jesus opens up in this great parable, then we need to start giving as the church. Generously celebrating the lost found, the dead brought to life. That is something to celebrate. That is something to be joyful about. We need to start giving as the church, which brings us to this final episode in Jesus' parable. And here is good news. The older son. The older son is someone who struggles with generosity. So if you struggle with generosity, maybe you can identify this. He struggles with the generosity of the father. What the generosity of father is shown to this brother who he can't even call a brother. He's bitter and resentful, but more than that, he struggles with the generosity that God has shown to him. He struggles with the generosity that the father has shown to him. You see, he's done the hard yards. He's been committed. He has worked for years for his father, and he is wondering, where's my recognition? Where's my celebration? Where's the payoff for all this? And from the older son's perspective, he has been generous to his father. And he has earned his place. He has earned his celebration. The way the older son sees it, the father owes him. And it's such a sad picture. He stands out there in the field, brooding, refusing to come in and join the celebration. For all his good work, for all his hard labor, for all his righteous commitment, this man knows nothing of the generosity of his father. And you know what else is sad? Our churches are full of older brothers. So many older brothers, good people who are struggling with the generosity of God, good people who are held up in their faith, held up in their discipleship because they're hung up their struggle with generosity. If you're struggling with generosity tonight, if on some level you can identify with that older brother standing alone out in the paddock, hear the good news. God will not leave you alone. God will not leave you alone. The father who has come out to meet that younger son, who has run out to meet that younger son, he comes out to meet the older son too. This son who all this time has taken his father's generosity for granted, this son who all this time has thought that he was earning the father's favor, this son who thinks that the father owes him, who resents his father's extravagant generosity. For this son, the father comes out and he pleads. Talk about setting aside dignity and honor. Talk about not caring what people think. He comes out to this son and he pleads with him. He doesn't invite, he doesn't ask, he pleads with him. He absorbs his son's bitter outburst, and then he gently opens up the good news for him. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. All that is mine is yours. Not just materially, but in spirit. And in that spirit, he calls his son to come and join the celebration. He doesn't just invite him, he pleads with him. This is an act of the most amazing generosity. The Father overwhelms his son's disgrace with grace. And it is good news. It is good news. I'm talking to that person who's struggling with generosity tonight. This is good news for you. Maybe just one or two of us, maybe the rest of us, not a struggle. But if you're struggling, this is good news for you. The God of the universe is pleading with you tonight. Putting aside his honor and dignity that he deserves, he loves you enough not to leave you where you are, but to come out to where you are and to plead with you. And hear this, God is not pleading with you to put a few more dollars in the offering. That's not what it's about. God is pleading with you tonight to receive the fullness of his generosity. All that is mine is yours, says our God. All that is mine is yours. God is pleading that you would know his generosity, that you would reflect his generosity in the giving of your resources and the giving of yourself. God has come to you tonight to plead with you, not to give more, but to give more like him. To give more like him. To come in, to join the celebration of the lost, found, the dead, brought to life. How do you respond?